So this has led us all the way up to your article, The Future Geopolitical Order and Bitcoin, an initial assessment. So it's such a huge topic to approach. What was the background to it all?
So really it was precipitated by the post-Ukraine kind of geopolitical shakeup. Because I think that had a number of dimensions to it, which brought a lot of these sort of latent sort of frictions to the fore. And so there are a lot of interesting questions that I think were hypothetical that became more real, and that forced serious people to start thinking about the way the global order is currently structured is now being placed under a huge amount of stress. And when you stress a system that's been built for many years, you start to think about, okay, how stable is the current system, and how could it evolve? How could it break? And you want to be prepared for that. So, maybe it's like this intellectual anxiety that I had about, okay, well, what does this mean? How is this potentially going to play out? That's why I call it an initial assessment of the future geopolitical order. One of the things that I tried to do in the paper was just bracket, first off, geopolitics is kind of it's like a filler term for everything. What do you mean by geopolitics? Literally it means all of human society. Now there's certain academic definitions of geopolitics, that focus on kind of geography and the intersection between geography and political systems and military capabilities and, state relations. But in the present context, it really just means the international order, which is the balance of power between states, which are the main actors in the system, and the rules that those states subject themselves to, in particular, the Westphalian concept of state sovereignty and the Concert of Europe agreement that you don't, violate the, territorial integrity of another great power. And that really is the main concept that Russia is accused of violating, essentially, that, their view of state sovereignty is sort of the old one, which is only great powers really matter, and other states are essentially, subject to, spheres of influence, and you're either with me or with someone else. And, that was there. And then you have to use force to sort of compel folks to act the way you want. And so I saw that as a critical, flashpoint that revealed not just the geopolitical dynamic, but really how the monetary system is going to become critical to this. Because unlike in the past where, we had pretty much you think about these previous periods of major historical confrontation, the most recent one, World War I, World War II, the global monetary system was not that well integrated. I mean, you could argue that there was a sort of first globalization leading up to World War I that broke in World War I. And that was a gold standard. There was lots of global trade. There was, lots of integrated specialization. And people thought that, in fact, there was debates in the British House of Commons that, economic interdependence would, make war foolhardy. There's no way that we would go to war with Germany. We're so connected. We are, so intimately dependent on each other that to, fight would just be insanity. And that they made the same arguments that you sort of hear now, that the degree of global economic and trade interconnection would make war, impossible to countenance. And then others were looking at that and basically said, well, the aspirations of rising states eventually decide, to go, and then economics starts to take a back seat. So this is why I think it's important to look at why I focused a lot on the monetary system in the paper, because sometimes you have this sort of technocratic view that it's just money, it's just the ledger account in your bank, but really money and geopolitics are intimately connected. And in a sense, the enduring or the existing monetary system is usually downstream of the global geopolitical arrangement, right? Whoever has the most hard power usually is the one who sets the rules, and part of those rules is what counts as money, and who has the power to enforce what counts as money and cut people out of that system and delete access to that money system is a expression and demonstration of power. So if you're trying to understand the future monetary arrangement, you kind of have to understand what you think the future geopolitical arrangement is going to be. And so, Bitcoiners are obsessed about thinking about the future monetary arrangement. But I feel like you're missing a huge and probably an essential component of that analysis if you don't have a view of what you think the future geopolitical order is going to be. So that's why it's you have to have that be at the center of your focus, and then try to assess, the relevance of Bitcoin in some of these, future scenarios.
And did you come into this paper with a hypothesis that you were trying to kind of prove, disprove?
So I've divided it really into two main sections. The first section is really just trying to like provide a schema to think about the global order, right, in different domains, and it gets really complicated. And my first objective was just to try to put some of these more technical and somewhat jargony pieces into one semi-coherent framework, so you can like understand what you mean when you say like the global monetary system. Like, what does that mean? And when you say there's frictions or potential vulnerabilities, like where, right? And I tried to locate, in the structure of the treasury market, in the structure of sort of the technical plumbing of the monetary system at like the micro scale, like how does that actually work? And there's a lot of focus on like FinTwit, right? on all the charts about, well, what is the Bank of Japan's yield curve control going to mean for the US 10-year treasury note? What are the flows between different global like sort of money centers and the offshore Eurodollar system? All these things get very technocratic and very complicated. And you kind of have to zoom in a bit. But ultimately, that's where, these endogenous sort of instabilities could erupt, right? And we've seen this in history. We've seen, from the sort of obscure plumbing of the monetary system, things break. And then all of a sudden the Fed has to do trillions of dollars of QE, and that has a geostrategic implication. And so, you kind of have to have an eye to like the microscopic details and then try to zoom out and say, well, what would this mean for geopolitical power relations? And so like Japan is a good example for this, in the sense that, Japan is a critical part of the offshore Eurodollar system, for lots of historical reasons. They've sort of taken over a lot of, kind of Eurodollar offshore lending from Europe, as Europe became much more highly regulated. And, post-Brexit, City of London kind of took a backseat to some of this stuff. And really because of Japan's closeness to China, as China integrated into the global dollar system, Japan became a main conduit of trillions of dollars of dollar lending into China. Japan is usually, not thought of as like being this major global player, but they are critical to this. But they're also geopolitically critical because they're essentially one of the closest U.S. allies. They're at the center of any kind of military deterrent scenario against China. They're a critical trade partner. So we have like a very close bilateral relationship with them across lots of different domains. And so seeing the intersection between these monetary dynamics, the geopolitical dynamics, the military dynamics, and then the rising challenge of China, especially in that East Asian sort of system of power, like these are like the things you need to be focused on. And there's no like one story that you can just easily tell that's like nice, clean. Like these are very complicated systems that all link together. And so I don't think I did a very good job of like covering it all, but I try to like touch on all the key elements of it, just to like get like the sort of the micro and the meso and the macro scales about like why the plumbing matters, why kind of the geopolitical power arrangements matter, and like in the sweep of history, why we see kind of this typical pattern of tension between rising powers and incumbent powers, between Eurasian land-based powers and maritime oceanic powers, and the different cultural political systems they have. Eurasian autocratic tends to be the match, and then oceanic kind of maritime commercial rule of law is sort of the historical inheritance we have from Britain and France. So these are like, they all come together. If you want to be hubristic enough to try to like look into the future and predict how the whole global arrangement is going to evolve in the next 5 or 10 years, like you literally have to try to capture everything. And then I try to lay out some like different, like a scenario with like different excursions, right? Like how this could evolve in different ways. And it's weird because, in this topic on, in social media and other contexts, like people have a lot invested in one particular scenario. Like it's almost like there's tribes associated with like, there is going to be a new gold, BRICS, commodity, Eurasian power block that's going to supplant the dollar tomorrow. And people get really emotionally invested in this. And sometimes, to your earlier point, like there's often this latent moral view, right? That like US bad, Russia good, China good, US bad, or vice versa, that people have as like their background, say, normative political views, that they sort of weight what they think analytically is likely to happen. And so I try to like not do that. It's like, what you think you want to happen is not necessarily the way it could happen. And also like one of the like critical like risks in all of this is that these changes to the global monetary system and the global balance of power typically don't happen in a smooth linear line that you can just say, here's the steps. Here's A to B to C to D. And we are now 30% of the way there. And you can easily see that because the value of the dollar or the value or the percent of global trade being used by the dollar is X, Y, or Z. Like people often default to these crude metrics as indicators of this change that may or may not be happening in this immensely complex global system. I think that's just like a category error. Like you're not going to get much meaningful information from those simple measures. You have to kind of understand how the global system is currently arranged and look for, ways it could just break in ways that maybe could shift the regime to a very different system.
So I wonder if people watching notice there's like a coffee suddenly appears.
Probably.
Huh. We should ask Derek. So when considering this and then looking at what happened with the sanctions against Russia and essentially the freezing of their US treasuries were essentially frozen, right?
So actually, Russia sold off all the US Treasury securities in 2018. What they held were dollar deposits in the Bundesbank, essentially associated with the ECB and the Bank of Japan. We froze in a coordinated G7 action on February 25th, I believe. It was that Sunday, just after the invasion, maybe 26th. About $300 billion of those dollar deposits, which was sort of by 2 orders of magnitude the largest sort of sanction on those types of dollar deposits that we've ever done. The closest equivalent was actually the Afghan National Bank, was about $7 billion or so that we seized when the Taliban took over.
So $7 billion to $300 billion.
Yeah,
I thought it was like $60 billion. I don't know why I thought that.
Yeah, it was $300 billion. It was
Jesus.
a lot. Yeah.
And okay, the sell-off of the US Treasuries, do we know why that was? Do you think that's in preparation?
Yes. I mean, they were making no secret of the fact that they were trying to create Fortress Russia, where they were trying to insulate themselves from Western economic coercion. That really started after their first military engagement into Ukraine in the Donbass and Crimea in 2014, where we sanctioned them. Nothing as significant as the most recent sanctions, but that was a pivot in their relationship to the U.S. and a strategic shift that they were posturing for, potential additional sanctions, and so they sold them off in 2018, and they did other things to try to insulate themselves from Western economic coercion.
Bought gold.
Yeah, they were buying a lot of gold. Now they didn't quite insulate themselves entirely. Obviously, they thought that. I think they were a little bit surprised by the degree to which, for example, the ECB went along with those sanctions, and actually Japan did too. About 2 days later.
I think the interesting thing that you mentioned in the article as well is that people were really willing to sanction them.
Yeah, and actually, this is something that the Chinese have taken close notes on as they start to think about, what sorts of backlash would they expect in a Taiwan scenario. Is when that invasion first occurred, there's a whole series of official actions that happened. The most high profile of which was the sanctioning, the blocking sanctions against the Russian central bank, the ability to access those dollar deposits. That was certainly among the more strategically significant. But there was also a wave of just spontaneous corporate, exit from Russia. Fire selling of their Russian assets to local partners, just getting out of the country, and doing voluntary boycotts of selling goods to Russian customers. And so that sort of wave became almost like a moral panic in a sense. Like you were a bad company if you were still doing business in Russia, right? And so there wasn't like an official U.S. sanction. It wasn't like the Treasury Department was telling you don't sell those widgets to Russia. It was just we can't be seen to be selling these things to Russia. So we're not. I think China looked at that and started to calculate and has continued to calculate whether that something similar would happen in a Taiwan scenario with Western multinationals. Whether aside from the official sanction that say the U.S. government would want to impose, there might be waves of social media essentially boycotts that have to be reckoned with.
Put Apple in a tricky position.
Oh yeah, I mean, a lot of multinationals, especially folks that have extensive first and second order dependencies on Chinese production, are like aggressively trying to posture for backups. Right? Apple's trying to move production out of China. It's very tall order for them because they were like one of the biggest proponents of Chinese integration into the global manufacturing system for the components. So they're trying to, spread some of it to Vietnam and India, but the scale of what they've built in China and the integrated kind of supply chains and third-party providers is just hard to replicate. It's going to be many years and very expensive in the process. But yeah, that is a key different dynamic. And so, particularly, like when we sanctioned Russia, there's things that we didn't sanction. Importantly, like, so we did not sanction their energy. We did not sanction the majority of their commodities. We didn't sanction. We had some like exemptions for like pharmaceuticals, kind of like COVID stuff. Like we didn't want to be seen like causing like a humanitarian crisis. But it was like pretty obvious that like we actually created like a helpful schema for the banks to say you can keep buying and facilitating the financing of Russian oil trade. Like, please don't self-sanction out of that, right? They were very explicit. They did not want to sanction Russian oil because they were especially conscious of potential impact on global energy markets and inflation. And so they were very clear to banks around the world, and US banks in particular, that like, we want you to keep facilitating these payments. And so it's then been like a very complicated, very messy, almost year now of like gradually trying to tighten the screws in different ways as the G7 tries to do this in ways to minimize the blowback, right? And this is tough because Russia's the third largest, I think, oil producer, the largest overall like commodity producer in the world. It's very hard to just like cut them out of the global system. And that's how I see, the global arrangement right now, from a simple schematic, right? There's like three major power centers you can think of. Like in any economy, you have money, you have like raw commodities, like inputs, and you have production manufacturing, right? That's very, very simple schema. Like you can think of it like a triangle. And, the G7 kind of has the dominant point of that triangle when it comes to money, right? G7, money, credit, and really also like the matrix of money and military and legal institutions. Like we dominate that. And that's by far the most powerful single like element of the global system. And then but that's just like money and military and law, right? It's like institutions, not like stuff, and it's not production. So the stuff is mainly coming from OPEC plus. So OPEC plus Russia, plus is the Russia piece. And that's, energy and raw commodities. Like that's how you have an economy at all, right? You need to extract resources and then turn them into final goods. And that final goods production comes from mainly China. And so China is the third leg. So you have essentially the G7, OPEC plus, essentially Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China. And when those sort of three elements of the global system were kind of in frenemy mode, when they agreed to kind of cooperate as part of globalization and specialize in those different areas, and we didn't weaponize the dollar system, they didn't weaponize supply chains, and they didn't weaponize, raw commodities, you had a nice global order. What we've seen, really in the post-Ukraine environment is like different parts of that triangle starting to break down. You could imagine like the sanctions on Russia's central bank reserves is like a big like weed whacker to the link between the G7 sort of military money system, legal system, and Russian commodities. And you can see what is now creeping up on the other leg is sanctions on or restrictions on Chinese technology, right? So like the various export controls we've started to place on Chinese semiconductor industry, which have really ratcheted up essentially the scale of our economic containment campaign against Chinese